wait. And baby, I'm TFC till I die.
Hello and welcome back to Toronto Till I Die, the Toronto FC fan show. I'm Mike Newell, and happy new year to the TTIDers out there. We've turned the calendar. It's 2024. I hope you had a great holiday season with your friends and family. TFC seems to have taken an extended holiday here because it's been awfully quiet since draft day on December 19th. So we're going to be, during this show, just quickly going over, catching you up on what's been happening with TFC, which is a whole lot of nothing, to be perfectly honest. It's not exactly true. We will look at some of the lack of player moves. We'll also recap the selections in the 2024 draft, really focusing in on Tyrese Spicer and the first overall pick. More Lore and Fede rumors, plus a lot more we'll get into. No Jeffrey P. Nesker this week, but Michael Singh is with me in the chair as well. Mike, how you doing? Happy New Year, buddy.
I know, I missed you, and missed talking about TFC. I was expecting to hop back on in the new year and have so many different things to catch up on. I was looking forward to this episode, and then complete blank. There's been a lot of moves though around the league.
Yeah.
We can touch on a little bit throughout the episode, but unfortunately, TFC land, man, nothing buzzing too much.
Well, it's funny because I was reading some of the comments from our post leading into this show, and everybody expected the Michael Singh notebook to get cracked wide open, and we're going to be just dropping rumor bomb after rumor bomb. If this player's coming, and this player's coming. And to be perfectly honest, there hasn't been kind of anything, right? Like even from the club, there hasn't been a lot of things leaking, has there?
To be honest, as I mentioned, and maybe a couple shows back, that's kind of I've distanced myself from a lot of that. I still was able to get that Tyrese Spicer scoop as a little Christmas present, a little treat for you guys before the end of the year. We'll see what else comes about between now and then, but it's not going to be my go-to priority, I think, on this show. Let's talk about what has come about, and maybe we can weed out some of the rumors, kind of what's been going on, take a little bit of a temperature check, and then we'll see what else comes about.
Yeah, for sure. Before we get into sort of TFC, maybe let's talk about a team that actually has been making a lot of moves. It's Portland. Has Portland become like the new Canadian territory that we've annexed or something? Because I mean, Phil Neville goes over there, and obviously he's a former national team assistant coach. But he just seems to be just picking off guys from the roster, being like, okay, I'll have him. Pantemis going over, obviously Kamal Miller being traded for Maxime Crepos. I don't know is that official now that he signed as a free agent? I know they were sort of on the verge of, but I don't know if they've officially announced that Crepos signed.
Yeah, I don't know if it's officially official, but it's pretty much official.
Right. So, I mean, right now, you look at somebody like a team like Portland, who basically has revamped their entire back line and their entire goalkeeping core in a couple of weeks. And it just looks like, that's a team that has decided to pull from the Canadian national team pool of players, especially you'd hope TFC may think about that considering the head coaches here. But your thoughts on that, and just your thoughts generally on what looks like has been, despite what TFC fans have sort of experienced, an actually busy MLS sort of off-season roster movement window.
Yeah, I mean, the Portland one's really interesting because I think, as you kind of touched on there, in a lot of ways, I feel like a lot of fans think that should be TFC, which, I mean, fair. You have John Herman, who is obviously the former men's national team head coach, and a guy like, for example, Kamal Miller. Man, when Montreal first made that trade from Orlando, I remember thinking, oh, this should totally be a guy that Toronto FC go after. And then they made that trade with Miami. And for Bryce Duke, they included a bunch of allocation money as well on top of it. I was like, okay, like maybe the price is a little bit too high. But then you see that trade to Portland. I'm like, 26 years old, signed to a long-term deal, knows that he works in John Herman's system. That seemed like a trade that would have checked a lot of boxes. And then you kind of rub some more salt on the wound by, this latest Max Crepeau rumor. Sean Johnson's only signed here for 1 year remaining. We'll see what happens afterwards, or if we'll see if he's maybe a guy that TFC tried to, float around to a couple of teams around the league to see if they're interested in a goalkeeper that can help them win now at a very, in my opinion, good price for what Sean Johnson brings. And you're like, dang, man, that's tough. But I mean, the ties are there now that Phil Neville had a stint with the Canadian men's national team as the assistant coach. You got Zach McGraw there too. It just
Yeah.
seems like they're building a really, really fun team there in Portland. Which I mean, usually, as most MLS fans, I would say, especially on the East Coast, don't watch Portland that closely. But I feel like a lot of Canadians this time around will definitely be keeping a closer eye on Portland.
Well, it's an organization that needs a bounce, right? They're kind of not quite in TFC's shoes in terms of they haven't finished last or anything like that. But considering they just fired their manager, they've had a lot of controversies on their end from off the pitch stuff in the front office. And they've missed the playoffs. They've sort of been in, they've been out. They missed the playoffs last year. So from that perspective, they need to make a move, and they've done that. And it's interesting that other teams are sort of, or that are in sort of similar positions that TFC have been able to make moves really quickly. Like Georgi Mihailovic is signed now with the Colorado Rapids. You're still
They're
seeing,
making a
obviously,
lot of moves.
they are making a lot of moves, right? Like Cincinnati's bolstering their roster, obviously with Champions Cup in mind.
Yeah.
You're seeing Columbus do the same thing. You're seeing a lot of teams be active in the market. And I wonder, we've talked about it a bit on this show, but TFC's current roster situation, I was just doing sort of the tally before the show. 23 players on roster, 11 on the senior, 3 on the supplemental, so the 21 to 24 slots. Then you got 4 players in the 25 to 29 slots, 1 in the 29 to 30, 1 on the 31 person, so the extra spot they give you. And then there's 3 that they didn't have listed on the team website, but I think they're senior roster players. Like it was Gavrin, Owosu, and Mailula. So they would probably be senior roster players as well. So, you're talking about 14 senior roster spots when you get 20 in total, right? So you have some space there, but I wonder how much flexibility TFC have right now, considering that there are probably still players that they need to or are looking to maybe offload
That's
before
it.
they can make moves.
That's the key right there, right? It's of those 23 players that you mentioned, like maybe 17, 16 of them should be in returning. Now, I guess the question that I have when we're talking about this offseason and why there hasn't been so many moves, what's the holdup, right? What are we which shoe are we waiting to drop here? And I think it's pretty obvious. Like the biggest 2 that have kind of held up Toronto FC's offseason, in my opinion. And there's a couple factors here. It's obviously Lorenzo Insigne and Federico Bernardeschi.
Yeah.
I don't know. Did you want to get into those rumors now?
Yeah, let's go for it. I mean, there are rumors out there on the 2 DPs. There's one that I think is a little bit more solid than the other, but just to recap, Federico Bernardeschi, the rumor is out there that he wants to go back to Juventus, that they're trying to organize what they call a dry loan, whatever that means. Really just a straight up traditional loan, no purchase option, anything like that. And that he go for the remainder of the Serie A season. And then I guess be coming back to Toronto FC in July, essentially. And then the other rumor is Lorenzo Insigne to Fiorentina, potentially willing to mutually part ways with TFC, come to some kind of arrangement, and then sign for a much lower salary with Fiorentina. Now, Fiorentina's sporting director has already come out and shot that rumor down and saying that there's no validity to what's out there, but obviously anytime that happens, TFC fans got really excited for about like 20 minutes on Saturday when that rumor came out.
Yeah, I mean, what I can say is the Federico Bernardeschi one, I think it's true. He would love a move back to Juventus. Would Juventus love a move back for Federico? That one I'm not too sure about.
Mm-hmm.
I think throughout the past couple of months, we even talked about this on the podcast. There are moments where Federico was, I would say, pretty close to moving on from Toronto FC.
Yeah.
And had it not been for like an ideal destination, I think on his end, then he probably would not be a Toronto FC player any longer. But he wants a move back to Italy in some capacity. Toronto FC would love to move on from Federico Bernardeschi. However, the one caveat to that is there's not a lot of bites there in Italy. There's not a lot of people willing to absorb all of Federico Bernardeschi's salary, and therefore the conclusion might just be that he ends up staying with TFC. But if there is some movement there, I would expect both sides to, happily move on from the situation. Lorenzo Insigne is the same thing, except his is a bit more difficult, right? He's making a ton more money. Uh, Again, teams don't want to take on that contract. Is he willing to really drop down from 14, 15 million a year to $3, $4 million a year? That's a tough ask for anybody, right?
Yeah.
And take away the sporting side from all of it too. He's got to really hate Toronto to want to give up that amount of money and move on. So probably more unlikely that TFC do find a partner for Insigne too. So I think they're trying and they're hoping something comes along when it comes to one or both of those players. But I don't know if it's moving in maybe the fashion that they were wishing for, perhaps.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you asked the question of like earlier, what's the holdup? Like, what's the holdup of getting these players out? And I think that the issue with TFC right now is that, Jason Hernandez talked about it in the season-ending press conference, was they got to find dance partners, and who's going to
Yep.
dance with these contracts? Not even just putting the DPs on one side, but some of the other contracts that they're trying to get rid of, some of the bad contracts that they have, they're hard for teams to swallow. Like, if you've built your roster in a certain way, and yes, you can get yourself a really good player, but they're on that salary. Unless TFC is willing to eat a significant loss on those two players. Well, they're going to take a significant loss if they leave anyway. But I mean, a significant amount of money, especially on Lorenzo Insigne. I mean, I don't think the chances are good, right? That they're gone, right? It's a good chance that by the time they hit training camp in a couple of weeks, it's not even that far away before you're starting to hear about players reporting. Both players, in theory, would show up for training camp.
Well, that's the funny part is like they show up to training camp. Okay, what type of environment do they enter? What type of environment do they create or help create when they're in that kind of mentality where everybody on the roster knows that both of these guys don't really want to be here? And the only reason why they're here still is because of the money and the paycheck, right? And even Lorenzo Insigne has come out and said in an interview about Napoli and saying he wanted to, even like this late as a couple months ago, saying that he would have loved to spend his entire career at Napoli. It was his dream to do so. And now he's a Toronto FC player, which is kind of like an afterthought, which is, we knew that kind of going in, but just the fact he's out late openly speaking about it at this point kind of shows you where his mindset is when it comes to Toronto FC.
Yeah, for
Bernardeschi,
sure.
same thing. Some rumblings have come across as well. I think some leaks about him telling Juventus fans that he would love to, kind of return to the club and that's his dream and stuff like that. So there are actual, like tangible things being now leaked publicly. And I think that again only adds a more difficult layer into that overall environment heading back into training camp. Like you want to talk about last year being toxic. This all sets kind of that ground for this year also being a bit toxic, does it not?
It does. And I mean, we talked about it at the time of his hiring that John Herdman was the type of person that can really build positive locker rooms and positive atmospheres around a team. But there are levels to that, right? Like, you can only be so good, right? You can only handle so much until the toxicity is so much that no matter how great of a culture builder you are, you can't just overcome some things, right? And it feels like we're heading potentially back to that now. We talked about the roster, and we're talking about these two guys, and we'll see what happens. There's still a month to go. It's only the 8th. So there's plenty of time in this January transfer window, at least in Europe, for something to potentially happen. But if you look at the rest of the roster, like, there's still some dead weight on the roster beyond the DPs.
Yeah.
Right. And the question is, they might actually even be harder to move because they're probably looking at whether interleague moves or things like that. Is there a market to move those type of players? Right. Is there a place where you can make a trade that can get you either GAM or a player back that could potentially help you? It feels like to me that we're going to be riding with a lot of the same players that we kind of game to know in 2023. It feels we're heading down that route.
I don't know if there will be as much turnover as I think some were hoping for, but there will still be turnover. I'm pretty confident in saying that. That said, like a guy like, Io Akinola or a guy like Diamande, yeah, those are the guys that I think you're kind of touching on, kind of referring to when you say there's some pieces that probably TFC will struggle to move on from and probably want to move on from. You're right. I mean, I think that's kind of clear with the contracts that they signed. And the only real avenue to tangibly move on from these guys is take a buyout for one of them, buy one of them out.
Well,
But again,
sorry,
is MLSC going to pay that money, right?
I mean, if there's a buyout and if you made a buyout rule and there was a player that signified that buyout rule, is Diamande, right? Like, it's in a sense that you kick the tires and hopefully that he recovers from his Achilles injury and that he can give you something next year, but like, the odds feel very, very long on that.
Yeah, like I would make a case for it being Io because I feel like those U22 initiative spots are so valuable in this league. And if they have the funds to go out and actually spend and really, kind of take advantage of that spot, that would be incredibly valuable. But you're right, like Diamante's the easy target because I don't know. Again, I don't even know if they have the funds to go out and spend and maximize really that U22 spot in the way that they would want to. Here's the other thing, the other part of the off-season holdup that I would be wondering about. Is TFC still a attractive destination for free agents? Is TFC still a place where, players would want to come by and want to play for? Or do you think the club had maybe a bit of a wake-up call during this off season and we're not able to have serious discussions with some of the free agents that maybe they thought they were going to be able to have those discussions with?
There's probably a bit of truth in that. I think a lot of players in the league, I think, always look at TFC as a club that will spend, and from a player perspective, if you're a free agent, you'll always entertain TFC because, if you're in that caliber, you might be able to really snag a good contract. Like, you might be like Matt Hedges last year, where you could get, that dollar, or you could get that extra year on the contract that you really want from TFC because they're willing to spend that type of money. But at a certain point, I think players talk, right? Like, players talk, and eventually the toxicity we talked about earlier, sort of the gradual decline of the club, basically from the end of the pandemic onward, are looking at TFC and it's like, is this really a team that can compete and contend right now? And the answer based on the evidence we've seen over the last couple of years, is no. And how many players are really going to sign up for that? How many players are going to sign up for a toxic environment, or at least a perceived toxic environment, where you're going to lose almost every game and you have two malcontent DPs that try to push their coach out the door? And that went out public, right? Like, that wasn't a thing that just gets talked about amongst players. That was out in the open, and players currently on the team and that now may have departed the team talked openly to reporters about that, right? So like, that's that piece about what Jonathan Osorio talked about, things leaking out of the locker room. No, you don't sign up for that. If Cincinnati comes and says, hey, you're not going to be a starter, maybe you're going to be our 15th guy on the roster, where maybe you're used to being a little bit higher, maybe you'll take that. Maybe you'll take a more of a supplementary role than you would if you went to TFC and TFC said, hey, you're going to be a starter on our team, right? And I think that might be what they've run into a little bit. I also think it's just down to the fact that they've got a lot of roster spots and contracts they can't move, and they're kind of, I don't want to say stuck with some players,
Yeah.
but they are stuck with some players.
Yeah, that's fair. And like, G Money Talks brings up a really good point here. Like, maybe no moves is also good. Like, it shows no desperation to go out and get the wrong player, shows no desperation to go out and overpay for certain free agents, because maybe they could have offered, free agents X amount of dollars, but would that have been, it's kind of you're alluding to, would that be a good decision, a good contract for them to land those players? I think they've learned from these past 2 years and some of the situations they found themselves in with some of these contracts, that you can't just go out there and swing big. You got to really be calculated in these decisions, because at the end of the day, MLS roster rules do impact you. And when you look at the teams that are excelling across the leagues, like the FC Cincinnati's, and of course easily the Philadelphia Unions, and the Columbus Crews, they're all doing a lot beneath that DP floor.
Yeah.
that they're finding ways to just take advantage of kind of these roster mechanisms. And Inter Miami is a little bit of a different story. They're doing things above that DP floor to take advantage of their roster building. But overall, like, I mean, when you look at the teams that have been successful, it's not necessarily the top spending teams in Major League Soccer that are making the big difference, right? However, because TFC have been so toxic, and because TFC have, like you said, their names kind of smeared publicly, in order to land a lot of those free agents that maybe they wanted, I feel like they would have had to overpay. So it's good that, I mean, they held pat, but at the same time, they might walk out of this free agency feeling a lot thinner than maybe they anticipated.
Well, you're going to have...
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that the team is going to have to hope for big improvements from some of the young players, right? Like, they're going to have to make major steps up if that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think they'll have to be leaned on a lot more. I mean, Kosi Thompson, for example, is back from his loan in Norway, right? And what is he going to be able to bring? That will be interesting to see if he sticks around, right? Maybe he is one of the players that they use as either a trade bait or let him go. But there's a lot of young players on that roster that are going to have to sort of make that next jump up. And I want to segue a little bit into another young player that TFC got the most, I guess, recent roster move. December 19th, TFC drafted Tyrese Spicer first overall in the SuperDraft. And, I think for some of us, it may have taken some of us by surprise. Obviously, you got the scoop on the show where he gave us a little heads up the day before. But I know you wanted to talk about him a little bit. I guess my question is, I don't know if we got a full grasp from draft day from some of the past. Like, who is he as a player? And why would TFC sort of, I don't know if bucking the trend is quite the right word, but why sort of take him number one?
Yeah. It's kind of what I alluded to, I think, on the show, where they wanted to bring in a piece that can contribute now. And when you're drafting through a couple age groups and you're trying to weigh potential versus impact now, the safer play, I guess, is to make a play on someone who could make an impact now or is closer to that point in their career where they can step on a pitch and make an impact. You've all seen highlights of the kid at this point. He's a bigger guy, pacey, and that's kind of like an MLS kind of build, right? That when even nowadays, even though the league has evolved, when you look at some of the most effective players in Major League Soccer, they're the type of guys who can, Greg Vanney used to say this all the time, can both play in between lines, but also run through lines. And I think that's kind of what TFC are hoping they get out of Tyrese Spicer. Definitely the latter, a guy who can run through lines. He's also a guy that right away would check a box for John Herman when you look at the roster and the formation that John Herman plays, right? John Herman would love to play with wingbacks. I think he's going to be looking at Spicer as either a wingback or a winger on the roster, right? And the one guy they left on the board that is an obvious, like, oh my God, I can't believe they didn't draft him is Kamani Stewart-Brains, the kid who we were talking about, we were hyping up. Would have loved to see him wear a Toronto FC shirt. Obviously a local kid, just 19, a couple years younger. But is he built for MLS? Is he how long will it take for him to be an actual contributor here in Major League Soccer? Those are the questions I guess they had to weigh. And obviously they went with, what I would consider probably be the safer choice. But at the same time, I mean, they look at a lot of the qualities that he has, and it's a lot that, translates well and works in Major League Soccer. So could be a good one.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because he was doing an interview with Matthew Shinetti from TSN and was sort of asked kind of the same question, like, who are you, like, what do you aspire to be, what has TSC told you in your conversations with them before you were drafted, and one of the things he pointed out was the fact that they see him as a potential Alphonso Davies type. Now, not to say that he's going to be like Alphonso Davies or better than Alphonso Davies. That's not the point of that conversation. But more this idea around he can have that flexibility of maybe playing that wing back position and attacking from deep, or play a winger and be dynamic that way. And look, his stats at Lipscomb look great, right? Like, it's 29 goals in about, 2.5 seasons at Lipscomb. And you're talking about a guy who can find the back of the net at the college level. Of course, does that translate to MLS? That's the biggest thing. Traditionally, that hasn't always been the case. And a lot of times guys who played striker tend to end up moving to different positions once they come to MLS. But we'll see, right? I think that there seems to be a type that's coming. It started with Cassius Mailula. It now is going on to Tyrese Spicer, where they're looking for more players that play direct, that have a little bit more pace and have a little bit more dynamicism and play directly.
Exactly.
That gets away from sort of the possession-based kind of play that we have kind of came used to and then tried to do again, but didn't quite work to the same success levels over the last couple of years.
And you could make the argument that in Herman systems, the wingback position is one of the most important positions on the pitch. But the way that, you look at an Alphonso Davies who, gets up and down the pitch, can also play as a winger, those positions are what Herman systems absolutely thrive off. It's also really demanding. Demands a ton of work. And someone who can cover a lot of ground quickly, someone who's able to take people on, play in between lines, all those things that we kind of touched on when it comes to Tyrese Spicer. I think that's what Herdman was referring to when he told Spicer about Alphonso Davies, right? Obviously, like you said, not going to be anywhere close to the player, not going to be a fair comparison whatsoever to the kid, but at least there's some of those qualities. Yeah, it's interesting because you have at this moment, as we're recording this, you have Raul Petretta there at left wing back. You have Lorenzo Insigne at left winger. Where exactly does he slot in at this point in time? Maybe that's a good thing that he has people to play in front of, and he can just kind of ease into Major League Soccer. just when you hear first overall pick, you kind of get excited and set expectations maybe unreasonably high for the kid.
Yeah, it's the one thing about the super draft. Like, number one pick sounds really great, but it's not like the NBA or the NHL or the National Football League, right? Like the number one pick in Major League Soccer in a lot of cases is, you're picking a very highly valued asset and you're hoping that they can produce right away. If they don't, you stick them on your two team, right? Like that feels like where the draft has gone the last couple of years. Though there have been, as you pointed out in previous pods, there have been success stories out of the
Hmm.
draft that have come in and made immediate impacts. And Kevin Martin's in the comments here actually sort of took a point I was about to talk about. It was that the profile that you just mentioned that John Herdman likes sounds a lot like Richie Larea, right? Some of the things that Richie can do now, not at the same level,
Yeah.
not as well, but it sounds like some of the things that Richie can do. They're trying to see if Tyrese Spicer might be able to do that at that wingback position if they do indeed put him there.
Yeah. Yeah. Like Richie has a little bit more of that tenacity. And I would even argue that like Richie, while powerful moving forward, different type of stride,
Mm-hmm.
different type of movement, Richie Larea did. But yeah, a lot of the things were fairly similar. I think what they're trying to develop Tyrese Spicer into. Man, Richie be a good fit here in Toronto under Herdman. We've seen him excel with the national team too. So
Well, let's get into a little bit of rumor corner. Again, I feel like these rumors are very, very loose and very, very, they're there. Somebody said it, but I don't know how much, stock we should take into them. But there are a couple of names that have been bandied out there. Angus McDonald is center back at Aberdeen right now. He's 31 years old. Um, just moved to Aberdeen last year, literally this time in the transfer window last year. Hasn't played a lot this past season. I think he's only has like 6 or 7 appearances this year after appearing 25 times last year for Aberdeen. I mean, look, a center back is a position that we talked about in terms of depth that TFC
yeah,
may want to take a look at. Again, don't know if there's any real fire to that rumor. But it feels like, a 31-year-old player, is that really where you want to go right now? Obviously, it depends on, the deal, if there is a deal to be struck there. And the other one that really sort of intrigued me was Debbie Flores. For those who don't know, Debbie played in MLS. And when I say played, didn't play very much. But played in MLS for Vancouver back in, I believe, like 2015, maybe 2016. Like I said, had a cup of tea with Vancouver and then moved on, I believe, to Greece. And then now he's in Hungary, playing in the first division in Hungary. Um, that has been a rumor that has been a little bit more persistent that seems to be out there, that they might be looking
yeah.
at bringing him back to the league. Again, not sure you heard anything about those, but those are two names that are sort of out there right now.
Yeah, the Angus McDonald one, what I'd say is like TFC need at least 2 more center backs this offseason. That's not a name that necessarily excites me though.
No.
Is that and I think TFC need like top level center backs, at least MLS level center backs. And I don't I'm not just 2 depth guys. They have some depth guys, right? They got the Shane O'Neills of the world. They have Ame Mabikas. They have the Sigurd Rosteds. They need a top, at least one like top center back, and then another solid center back. Personally, I don't know too much about the players, so maybe I'm completely underplaying him, but just not something that really, really excites me. But maybe he's a guy who fits the MLS kind of mold here. Um, the other one, Davy Flores, that one is a bit more intriguing to me because he offers something TFC just don't have, and that's someone who's such a incredible ball winner in the middle of the park, and I think that's kind of where he excels. When you look at TFC's kind of midfield here, we're looking at obviously Alonso Cuello, we're looking at Latif Blessing, Brandon Cervania is injured, and then Jonathan Osorio. That's really it in the
Yeah,
center of
it
the
is thin.
park. So very, very, very thin, and that's another position where you need another 2, 3, 4 guys even to really shore up that position. So he would check a box that TFC just straight up don't have. So that's why that one would be a little bit more interesting from a TFC perspective. What I can what I can offer up here is that when you look at the position TFC's in, it's when we talk about them missing out on MLS free agents and maybe not making his moves as quickly, is that TFC have an abundance of international roster spots. Because not only do they have the spots that existed last year, they're also going to be getting access to an additional 2 international roster spots, because they're going to have guys who are international players that were on the roster for 12 months at the start of the season. Um, Therefore, that for Canadian clubs, it unlocks an extra 2 international roster slots. So I think they're going to be active in using those slots. Um, when exactly? I mean, they're probably going to do it before, at least a lot of it before the start of the season, before the start of that second training camp is typically when they like to really get things going there. Um, but the MLS route might not be as feasible as we first thought.
Yeah, no, because I feel like if they're going to go the MLS route, they're going to have to make trades at this point, right? Like,
But
and again, it speaks to what do you have in terms of value that other teams are going to want. And outside of GAM, which you can't really give up. I mean, they've gotten some extra GAM, which is good, but is that enough to really sway teams? And that will be interesting. I will throw this name out there. Obviously, you kind of brought him up already. Richie Larea is out there. Now, he is not going to go back to Vancouver. They're not going to make him a DP. Surprise, surprise. He is still a Forest player. I think his contract's up at the end of next season. I'm pretty sure it's at the end of next season.
2025, I think he was signed through.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
So the end of
year and
next
a
season.
half. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, is there a chance? I mean, I don't know. Like, it's one of those things where, yeah, again, they'd have to negotiate probably another loan with Nottingham Forest, but
hmm
I don't see him going to Forest and playing. And I don't know, what options there are in Europe, right? So,
Yeah.
does TFC make sense for another return for the baby boy, Richie Larea? Happy birthday. Happy belated birthday, Richie Larea, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, personally, selfishly, I'd love it. What I'd say about Nottingham, I think a big reason why didn't it didn't work out there very quickly for Richie was because of his relationship with Steve Cooper, who is now, as of a couple of weeks ago, the former Nottingham
Mm-hmm.
Forest manager. So now that they have a new head coach in, Nuno's at the helm, is that something that maybe Nottingham wants to revisit? I don't know. I don't know really what their depth is like at that position, if they would even be worthwhile for them, or if that ship has kind of sailed. Now, if it hasn't, maybe there's a lot of reasons why it makes sense in Toronto. The one, I guess, rebuttal to that is that when you look at kind of the right side, it was Kobe Franklin and Jim Marchetti have that right wing back position. Uh, I don't want to say locked up, but they have a pretty good foothold at that right wing back position. Those are 2 very young kids. We know, I think Herman coming in really wants to, focus on developing those that Canadian talent. He's already spoken incredibly highly of Jaquil in particular, about how naturally he fits into that right wing back role and how well he did in the weeks leading up to like the conclusion of the season. So you add that with arguably TFC's best player last season, last or second last big contract, and kind of like Jonathan was, so um, a reasonable way without, I guess, compromising maybe the roster a little bit.
No, I don't know. I hear you, and it's one of those things where I think a lot of TFC fans, will keep that in their heart, and the sort of hope is there. But I don't disagree with you, right? I think it makes sense. You got to figure out between Kobe and Jamar, what do you really have there at the right wing back position, and can they both can one of them really sort of stand out and be the guy at that position? If they choose to do that, right? Maybe they put Shaquille more on the wing going forward. But as of right now, you're right. I think that role is sort of sewn up. But I think CFC fans will always have that little kernel of hope in the background. Because look, if you can get Richie Laryea on this team, he makes you better, right? I don't think there's any doubt around that.
It's just at what cost? Right. It's just like there are bigger things on the roster that need to be addressed aside from the wingback position.
No, 100%. Yeah. And a last thing before we jump out here, a small little note. Last week we got an incoming announcement, but maybe not the one TFC fans were looking for. Jason DeVos has come in as an assistant coach to John Herdman on the coaching staff. It feels like TFC has become the refugee camp of men's national team staff since John Herdman's come over. But Jason DeVos joins. Not a big surprise, I think, to a lot of people. Obviously, Herdman has a lot of time for Jason DeVos, and obviously he's had him on his staff for the World Cup. Former interim secretary general, obviously just stepped away from the post after the new hiring last month. Thoughts on on Jason DeVos coming in as an assistant? What do you think he's going to bring? Obviously, a well-experienced center back in England, played a long time there, and obviously a former national team captain.
Yeah, I don't have too many takes on this. I've seen some people come out pretty hot either way. I don't think I think it's one of the least surprising moves. What he'll bring, he has a lot of relationships with a lot of players. He knows the Canadian system and Canadian players incredibly well, and obviously has that relationship with John Herdman. So I really don't think it's too much of a surprise. I don't get too worked up when it comes to assistant coaches and takes like that,
fired
because
up by assistant coaches these days. Come on,
because we don't know exactly the level of impact that they make. At the end of the day, it's all very surface level from the examination and the analysis that we're able to do, unless we're in that environment every single day and seeing what it is that they do, right? So it's tough for us to really have takes on stuff like that, but I will say it's not a surprise at all.
No, I don't think so either. And it sounds like that's probably going to be, I don't know if they're filling out any other roles on the coaching staff. It sounds like they're pretty, at this point, set with the coaching staff. And now it's kind of just a wait and see game for a lot of TFC fans. What shoes are going to drop in terms of the roster, and obviously counting down till, sort of the beginning of February when training camp kind of starts, right? Because you're going to hear of players reporting, but obviously those are the Champions Cup teams that are going to be getting in a little bit early in the end of January here. But usually TFC are usually in camp by early February. They're usually here and doing their medicals and things like that. And then we'll figure out what hot destination they're flying off to for the first part of camp. Do we even know that yet? I haven't seen anything.
I would say sooner. Like usually it's January.
Oh, usually it's this month. End of January. Yeah. What do you know where they're going? Have you heard where they're going? I actually haven't heard anything.
Yeah, they're going to Cali.
Oh, they're going back to the Coachella tournament?
Yeah, they're going to go to I don't know if that's the name of the tournament anymore.
Okay.
But they're definitely doing the
it's a Coachella Valley tournament or something like they did last year, but I'm not sure if they're going to be in it this year. But all right, well, look, it's interesting times at TFC, if not slower times. We'll continue to sort of keep an eye on what's happening at the club, and we'll be back next week. Thank you again for listening to another Toronto Till I Die. Massive favor, rate, review the show, give us a thumbs up, and subscribe on YouTube. 5 stars, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Helps a lot of people, new people, get in contact in the show and into the TFC Live community. For Michael Singh, I'm Michael Newell. See you next week, y'all. Cheers, everybody.
And wait, and baby, I'm TFC till I die.